Thom Hartmann here with you. And is the U.S. in the middle of a coup? Asks the headline, an article by Andrew Griffin in The Independent, one of the British newspapers. The headline specifically says, U.S. in the middle of a coup by Donald Trump, Michael Moore warns. And actually, you read into the article and you find that Michael Moore is warning that we are in the middle of a coup by Steve Bannon. And, you know, similarly, there's Jake Fuentes over at Medium.com wrote a fascinating piece that was published this morning, or yesterday, I guess it was. The immigration ban is a head fake, and we're falling for it. And he goes through this whole series of things, that this is just first of all, this is a conspiracy theory, right? It may or may not be the case. I mean, it's entirely possible that all the Trump administration is doing is saying, hey, we made a bunch of campaign promises. We are going to deliver on those promises as fast as we can, or at least cause the American people to think that we're delivering on them as fast as we can. For example, the executive order that Trump signed that said that for every new regulation, 2 have to be deleted. That's how the press picked it up. That's how the press ran with it. That's how the Trump people pushed it out. It's a lie. It's not what the executive order says at all. The executive order merely suggests guidelines and things like that. I mean, there's no there, right? It's purely cosmetic. But the press ran with it, and all the trumpets or Trumpies or Trumpistas or whatever you call, Trump loyalists these days, brown shirts, I don't know. They all seem to be going, oh yeah, hey, finally, he's keeping his promises. Isn't that cool? So what Jake Fuentes is suggesting is that, yeah, it's possible that he's simply keeping his promises, or at least trying to create the appearance of it. It's also possible that this is intentional chaos. That this is the kind of stuff that happened, in the early 30s in Germany. This is the kind of stuff that happened in the early aughts the aughts and the teens in Russia of the last century. Before the Bolshevik Revolution and all that, it's possible that, basically it's a shock and awe campaign. We're going to so blow your minds that you can't function. And you being the press and the American people. So what he's suggesting is, number one, launch a series of executive orders in the very first week, make them just absolutely right over the top. He says, beforehand, we identify one of our opponents that will complain loudly and will dominate the news cycle. Immigration ban. Perfect. We craft the ban to be 20% more extreme than we want it to be. Jake writes, let's say make the explicit decision to block green card holders. That's crazy. But, we'll do it. Now, I'm not reading him. This is my take on what he has to say. Yeah, make it over the top so that the press goes for it. And then while the press is, and then all these people pour into the streets. And by the way, pouring into the streets is a great thing, but it's not, we've got to retake political power. This is if there's anything that I learned from being part of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, and mostly the anti-war movement, frankly, in Michigan State University in the 60s, it was, SDS started as a justice movement, essentially, for lack of a better phrase. But the war turned it into an anti-war movement. But the one thing that I remember that I learned from that is that marching in the streets isn't enough. You've got to take political power. So number 3, he says, we watch our opposition pour into the streets, protesting the extremes exactly as we intended. The protests dominate the news, but our base doesn't watch CNN anyway. Of course, the Republican base is watching Fox, which is saying, oh, look at these poor, sick people in the streets. The ACLU will file motions to oppose the most extreme parts of our measure. That's actually going to be useful, too. We don't actually care if we win. We made it more extreme than it needed to be. Number 4, while the nation's attention is on our extreme executive orders, slip in a few more nuanced moves through. For example, reconfigure the National Security Council so it's led by our inner circle, or gut the State Department's ability to resist extreme moves. That will have massive benefits down the road, writes Jake Fuentes. The NSC are the folks that authorize secret assassinations against enemies of the state, including American citizens. Yeah, day before yesterday, Trump killed an American citizen with a drone strike. President Obama had killed her brother. She was 8 years old. Her brother was 16. They were both the sons of a terrorist in Yemen, I think it was, but you know, an American citizen. So you know, and then they go through this. When the dust settles, we have 100% of the executive order we wanted, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. So are we in the midst of a coup? And what have past presidents said about the warning of this? Oh, by the way, our webmaster in the UK, Nigel Peacock, he says, the petition to stop Trump coming to the UK has now reached 1.7 million signatures, so it must be debated before Parliament on the 20th of February. It won't stop the visit, but it'll give some politicians the opportunity to rant. And he noted this independent article that I just shared with you. Well, John Kennedy gave a speech. President John Kennedy. Yesterday, we went back to Franklin Roosevelt for his thoughts on what's happening today. John Kennedy gave a speech before the American Association of Newspaper Publishers, and back in, I think it was 1962. And he talked about the importance of a free press. Now, of course, he's talking to newspaper publishers. There's a certain, you know, there's a reason for that. But I think that this was sincere on the part of Kennedy. And I think it's apropos of today. So here's President John Kennedy.
No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
Now, isn't that amazing? He says no administration should fear the newspapers, you know, and that the newspapers should be, you know, alerting people. He continues. Here he is.
For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them.
Wow. Can you imagine Donald Trump saying that? I mean, this is the Bay of Pigs. You know, John Kennedy took full credit for that, even though, you know, it was planned by Richard Nixon in 1960, while Nixon was vice president. The Bay of Pigs was set up as an invasion of Cuba that was supposed to happen in October of 1960. It was going to be Nixon's October surprise so that he could beat Kennedy in the 1960 election. He was going to throw out Castro because the main thing in 1960, those of you who are not old enough to remember this, and I'm barely old enough to remember this, the main thing that Richard Nixon was being beat up by Kennedy about in the 1960 election was that he let Castro go communist. Castro took over Cuba, and I think it was 58 or 59. He declared loyalty to the United States. He asked for our support, and the Nixon administration, or the Eisenhower administration, Richard Nixon at that point was basically running the Cuba desk. Well, not basically, he was running the Cuba desk and was making policy, and Eisenhower had a heart attack, and Nixon was doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the White House. And basically Nixon said, no, we're not going to give you any support. And so Castro turned to the Soviet Union. So, and then Kennedy took full responsibility for that. Back to John Kennedy. Here he is.
Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution.
As I keep pointing out.
Not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion.
And he said the press exists not to give the public what they want, but to inform them. Well, keep in mind, this is when the Fairness Doctrine was in place. This was when media ownership rules were in place. There were over 10,000 owners of the major American media. Virtually every radio and television station in the country was owned by a local family or business. Not so today. And the fairness doctrine is gone. So now, actually, we have the exact opposite of what Kennedy just described. Now we have a media whose only job is to entertain. And information is only viewed as a show element. And, if it's salacious enough, it flies. If it's not, it doesn't, which makes a coup a whole lot easier. Back to Kennedy.
This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
There you go. A free and independent press, John Kennedy says, is essential. How can you have a free and independent press if it's owned by 5 or 6 corporations who answer exclusively to their stockholders? But, that's sort of another rant. Are we looking at a coup in the United States? A right-wing blogger taking over the national security apparatus of the United States.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And is the media being played like a fish on a line? I mean, it's increasingly looking like this to me.